Luke Johnson of the New Orleans Advocate Times-Picayune joined to talk a little Taysom Hill. We get some further clarity on New Orleans Saints OTAs and a bunch of offensive linemen for the New Orleans Saints getting shown some love by Pro Football Focus. That's all on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
It's the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into a fresh week here at Locked On Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, here every single Monday through Friday, 5 days a week, covering your New Orleans Saints. Today's episode is brought to you by our good friends over at Built Bar. Go to BuiltBar.com and don't forget to use the promo code LOCKED15. You'll get 15% off of your next order. On today's episode, we'll take a look at some news and notes around the New Orleans Saints to open up. We've got some info on OTAs and what to expect there. We're talking about Week 1 fan attendance, as well as some preseason game times finally being announced. Then we'll take a look at the Saints offensive line. 3 out of 5 getting recognized by Pro Football Focus as top 10 players at their respective positions, 2 of which also in the top 5. And then we'll wrap up today's show with part 2 of our conversation with Luke Johnson of the New Orleans Advocate Times-Picayune as he discusses Taysom Hill and his visit to Taysom's hometown, as well as why Taysom Hill deserves a little bit more credit within the offseason conversation here. That's all on today's episode of Locked On Saints. And as always, I am your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on Twitter, Deputy Brand Manager over at CanalStreetChronicles.com, and your Tuesday co-host with the National Locked On NFL podcast. So we got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints, your team every day. And as we begin with today's episode, I want to remind everybody that's listening on the podcast, you can always watch the show over on YouTube now by subscribing to the Locked On Saints YouTube channel. And if you're watching on YouTube and need to take the show on the go, you can always do so by finding Locked On Saints on your favorite podcast provider. So I want to start off with OTAs on today's episode as we go through news and notes, getting into a fresh week here with Locked On Saints. And I want to start off with OTAs because today begins the OTA period and subsequently phase 3 of the NFL offseason. Now remember, the Saints players were one of the groups of players amongst the NFL or across the NFL that ended up opting out of offseason voluntary workouts in person. But a lot of teams and players have come together to sort of find the most conducive way to make this available and safe for players that do want to participate and teams that would like their players to participate as they all get ready for training camp. And it seems that the New Orleans Saints have been able to find a way to do this with their players, as Sean Payton updated during the New Orleans Saints Hall of Fame Golf Classic Open that 87% of players were expected to be at the facility for OTAs. That means about 9 players not attending, but none of which surprises, according to the head coach. So this is good news for the New Orleans Saints and their players that they were able to figure out a way to make all of this happen. So the focus right now, which remember that OTAs, you can do 7-on-7s, you can do 11-on-11s. They're all no contact, but there is a little bit of speed there. There are some injuries that pop up during those times. It looks like part of the negotiation or part of the sort of arrangement here is that the team is only really focused on conditioning and weights right now, which probably makes these players feel a lot safer who are trying to make sure that they preserve their bodies getting into training camp here in the next couple of months. So you don't want to expect really any of the big highlights or anything like that that might sometimes come from OTAs, the nice catches, 11-on-11 drills, things like that, because you might not get them. But when it comes down to what these OTAs look like, at least the team is working together. Now, after OTAs, we get into the mandatory minicamp, which you can expect players to be a part of. And then, of course, training camp once we get into July. But as we get into August, then all of a sudden, the conversation begins to shift to actually being under the lights and actual game time. And that's going to open with the New Orleans Saints traveling to the Baltimore Ravens. And we actually have times now for 2 out of what will be 3 preseason games. Remember, only 3 preseason games this year because there are 17 regular season games in or after that exhibition season. So in the exhibition season, they'll open up in Baltimore against the Ravens at 6 p.m. Central Time on August 14th. Then the next game will be back at home against the Jacksonville Jaguars. That's going to be at 7 p.m. on August 23rd. No news yet on the time or date of preseason game 3, which is going to be against the Arizona Cardinals, the other bird. So when it comes down to it, those are the days that you can expect to see the Saints in action for the preseason. This preseason, of course, being very important for the New Orleans Saints, is there are several position battles to look at, even down to punter. You can look at quarterback 1 and quarterback 3 with Ian Book and Trevor Siemian. You can look at the linebacker position, the cornerback position, interior defensive line. So many opportunities for a lot of players, and also the players that may not even be fighting for a top spot in the depth chart, just fighting for a spot on the 53-man roster. They get their opportunity this year, unlike last year where they had to cut down from 90 to 53 across the NFL without ever seeing anyone in full speed, full pads, helmet action during the preseason, as there was no preseason last year thanks to COVID. And finally, the last piece of news that I want to make sure we discuss before we move on with today's episode, Dennis Lauscher, the New Orleans Saints president, updated on an interview about the New Orleans Saints' expectation for fan attendance week 1 as the Saints open up the season hosting the Green Bay Packers. Quote, I 100% expect full attendance in regards to home games at the Superdome. That is fantastic news for New Orleans Saints fans and the city of New Orleans. That's great news for the Superdome. That's great news for the city as a whole. And of course, great news for the Who Dat Nation all around the world who want to go and cheer on their team for the first time since the 2019 playoff exit that came with the Saints playing against the Minnesota Vikings, unfortunately. But more importantly, this is great news for the New Orleans Saints and New Orleans Saints fans who want to root on their team in the Superdome to open the 2021 NFL season. So coming up next, we're going to talk about the Saints offensive line. 3 of the 5 players noted as within the top 10, thanks to Pro Football Focus in their respective positions. We'll talk about those 3 and what kept the other 2 out of contention, even though 32 players were ranked at every single position. So we'll talk about that. And of course, we've got Luke Johnson coming up to talk a little Taysom Hill, as well as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Credit Karma, who are introducing the Credit Karma Money checking account. This is pretty cool. So you open up a checking account with Credit Karma, and you end up getting a debit card that gives you reimbursements, or you can win cash reimbursements as you spend. So basically, you pay with your debit card, and you'll be notified if you win on the spot, and then you're going to get instant karma cash added back to your spend account. This is an FDIC insured spend account that you can open up for free. There's no minimum balance requirement, no overdraft fees, and it's free withdrawals with a network of over 50,000 ATMs at your disposal. Credit Karma Money progress starts here. And right now, visit creditkarma.com/winmoney to open up your free account and start winning instant karma. That's creditkarma.com/winmoney to sign up for free and start winning instant karma today. That's creditkarma.com/winmoney. Instant Karma, sponsored by Credit Karma. No purchase necessary. Exclusions and terms apply. See rules. Banking services provided by MVP Bank Incorporated, member FDIC. Maximum balance and transfer limits apply. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. I want to talk a little bit about the New Orleans Saints offensive line, which has consistently been one of the better offensive lines in the NFL, although they had a little bit of struggle in 2020. Even Ryan Ramczyk took a bit of a step back. Eric McCoy kind of dropped off a little bit, but nothing too concerning, right? Just your usual sort of, hey, we're playing a season without any type of preparation type of drop off, which you saw across offensive lines around the NFL. So I want to talk a little bit about where 3 of the 5 Saints offensive linemen ranked on Pro Football Focus's positional rankings that they sent out today. Now, they sent these out regarding offensive tackle, which includes both left tackle and right tackle, offensive guard, of course, including left guard and right guard, and the center position right in the middle of it all. So let's start off in the tackle position, because this is where the Saints hit big. Ryan Ramczyk and Terron Armstead both ranked amongst 32 tackles across the NFL, both 3 and 4 respectively. Ryan Ramczyk at number 3, Terron Armstead at number 4. Ramczyk was also graded as the second highest tackle since 2006, behind only the legend himself, Joe Thomas, and he's considered to be the most valuable NFL offensive tackle at the moment. Armstead, who ranked 6th most valuable as a tackle over the last 7 years, and for the last 6 years, he's also put up top 10 pass blocking grades as well. So the bookends for the New Orleans Saints continue to hit high marks. here ranked 3 and 4, both of which within the top 5, and Ryan Ramczyk taking his rightful place in the top 3. Now, Ryan Ramczyk making these types of rankings, these types of lists, and getting these types of laurels, really, to hang his play on during during the expiration, right, the final year of his rookie deal. He's in a contract year here, and the Saints, I think, would still like to get him extended before the season begins. Ian Rappaport did mention that back in March, so we'll see how quickly they're able to progress with that before training camp begins, or once training camp begins in a couple of months. Now, let's take a look at the third offensive lineman for the New Orleans Saints that ranked on one of these lists. It was Erik McCoy, who ranked as the number 8 center in the NFL out of 32. 4th ranked center in the league as a rookie back in 2019, and just outside the top 10 in 2020. So he falls at number 8 here heading into the 2021 NFL season. Now, that, of course, is fantastic news for Erik McCoy, as he's only going into his 3rd season in the NFL, and it will be interesting to see if Erik McCoy ends up staying at center, or if the Saints try to move Cesar Ruiz to his natural position at center and then bounce Erik McCoy out to right guard. But he's playing so well at this position. There's a really, really good argument to be made here, especially after investing a year in Cesar Ruiz at the right guard position, to just keeping things as they are and maintaining the stalwart of your offensive line at the center position in Erik McCoy. Now, Cesar Ruiz, you'll notice his name not present on the offensive guard list. Same thing with Andrus Peat. Neither of them listed within the top 32 offensive guards around the NFL. And here is why. There should be no surprise really when it comes to Cesar Ruiz, right? It was his rookie season coming in, no training camp, no real way to get ready for a position change. But at the same time, he struggled. Let's just be honest. He struggled in his regular season here and in his rookie season. Ruiz ranked 81st overall in PFF's overall offensive grade. He ranked 59th in their run blocking grade and 105th outside the top 100 as a pass blocker, allowed the 24th most pressures in 2020. So again, he struggled. Now, as for Andrus Peat, the left guard, and somebody that New Orleans Saints fans were probably very pleased to not see on the top 32 offensive guards list, ended up 62nd when it came to offensive grade in 2020. And he was also 62nd in run blocking, 64th in pass blocking, 35th most pressures allowed. Now, Ruiz was not credited with a sack in 2020 by Pro Football Focus, but Andrus Peat was credited with 4, good for 11th most in the NFL, just outside the top 10 most when it came to sacks allowed. So for the New Orleans Saints, the good news is that they have a very, very good offensive line. They're one of only 2 teams, along with the Cleveland Browns, to have 3 players within the top 10 at all 3 of these lists. The Cleveland Browns had 2 guards and a center, J.C. Tretter, who's of course also the NFL Players Association president, but the New Orleans Saints had 2 tackles and 1 center. So just 2 teams out there with 3 players within the top 10 on these lists. And the New Orleans Saints should feel very good going into the 2021 NFL season, expecting hopefully a big step up in progression for Cesar Ruiz wherever it is that they have him play. But I'm actually starting to warm up to the idea of him staying at right guard, even though I've been pretty adamant about him moving to center. But just seeing how good Erik McCoy has continued to perform, it makes a lot more sense to just keep one of your 5 positions there, the best amongst the best in the NFL, as opposed to taking a risk at 2 spots along the interior. And of course, when you have 2 new quarterbacks there as well, you probably want to make sure that that offensive line is as sturdy as possible. We'll be talking about that a little bit next here with Luke Johnson of the New Orleans Advocate, Times-Picayune, the quarterback situation, but specifically talking a bit more about Taysom Hill. I admit we give a lot of airtime to Jameis Winston on this show, as well as really across media altogether. So let's talk a little bit more about Taysom. Luke did a great job and a great piece back in November about visiting Taysom Hill's hometown and what he learned about his upbringing. And we'll talk a little bit more about why Taysom Hill deserves a little bit more credit in this offseason conversation. As we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by our good friends over at BuiltBar.com, the best tasting protein bars ever made. And I'm not even kidding. These are the best tasting protein bars ever. And the best thing about them is that they're not only delicious, but they're healthy 2. So let's talk a little bit about some of the flavors here. You've got 9 delicious flavors plus a rotating cast of limited edition flavors that you can find on the website all the time. Coconut almond, cherry raspberry, mint brownie, peanut butter brownie, and a couple of others as well, including salted caramel, which I think is absolutely delicious. And each of these flavors is covered in 100% chocolate. Now, when you hear that, you probably think, oh, okay, it's just another protein bar that's got like 10 grams of protein, but it's got a ton of sugar. And that's just simply not the case when it comes to these Built bars. For instance, you can find most of these bars with 17 grams of protein, only 130 calories, and 4 grams of sugar, as well as 4 grams of net carbs. And even if you go the next step up to something with 18 grams of protein, you're still looking at 5 grams of sugar and 5 grams of net carbs. So these are really, honestly, truly not only the best tasting protein bars on the market, but simply the best protein bars on the market, no questions asked. So if you want to try them yourself, head over to BuiltBar.com and use the promo code LOCKED15, LOCKED15, use the numerals, and you'll get 15% off of your next order, whether it's your first or your next. That's code LOCKED15 at BuiltBar.com. All right, y'all. Thank you very much once again for being here for today's episode of Locked On Saints. Now we're going to get into part 2 of our conversation with Luke Johnson from the New Orleans Advocate Times-Picayune as we dive in a little bit on Taysom Hill, his story, and this offseason. The story of Taysom Hill is one that's still being written as well. And you did a really, really phenomenal piece. It was in November last year, a couple of starts into Taysom Hill's run, to where you went and visited his hometown for 3 days and then wrote about his upbringing. What did you learn more about Taysom Hill being in the midst of where it all started?
Yeah, that was, first of all, like, awesome for my editors to agree to do that in the middle of like a pandemic year,
Yeah. How did that? That's actually a question I should ask you: is how did this all come about? Did you bring this to them?
Yeah. So it was actually, that was before his first start. So I'm sorry, it was right after his first start. So he started against the Falcons, and then they were playing the Denver Broncos, and I was just like, okay, well. Denver is a short drive, short in comparison to where it would be from driving from New Orleans.
Sure.
It's like 8 hours. So it's like, okay, well, if I just change my flight to fly up a little bit earlier, I can drive out there and try to talk to a bunch of people who he knows and what it means for somebody to come from this very, very small community in Idaho, really in the middle of nowhere, to then be on this huge stage as a starting quarterback. Like, what does that mean for that place? And they were like, yeah, go for it. So I went for it. It was awesome. It was like one of the most beautiful drives I've ever done in my life, going from Denver to Idaho. And, what I learned was, his story kind of resonated with me because I grew up in a very small town, Wisconsin. I mean, that's most of Wisconsin, right? It's just like communities of 3,000, 5,600, whatever. It means something for me whenever I see somebody from my community go on to succeed. And it's not even like on this huge level, like an NFL starting quarterback, right?
Right.
So I could imagine what it meant for people there, and it meant a lot. And it wasn't like his image and likeness was all over the town, but you say Taysom Hill and everybody has something to say about it.
Sure.
And they all had memories of him. And, some of it was, it was really interesting just seeing about this guy who was so good, so early, so young. It brought out a lot of people who were just these huge Taysom Hill fans from the time he's like a freshman in high school to people who couldn't stand him because he was so good. And people were openly talking about that, right? Yeah. And it was it's a really interesting dynamic, and I think it creates a certain thing in a person. And I think for Taysom, that created some grit for him.
Sure.
And I think that's a big part of the reason why you see a guy who had 4 season-ending injuries in college end up being a successful player in the NFL, sticking out, even though the odds were very long against him.
Yeah, now here he is challenging for a starting role in what has been one of the most coveted offensive systems over the past few, I would say since Sean Payton and Drew Brees, started everything up in 2006 or restarted everything up in 2006. I mean, what an incredible journey for, a young guy out of a small town like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And look, I know Taysom, may have his limitations compared to like Drew Brees and everything like that. Sure. But there is just a huge part of me that is just dying to see what a Sean Payton offense would look like with a quarterback like that.
Yeah.
I think people are when they like to make jokes about Taysom Hill and how he's not a quarterback or whatever. It's just right. He's not Drew Brees, but but he is an incredible football player.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And if you just if you give a guy like that an opportunity to do what he does best and not try to run somebody else's offense. Like last year, he was very much running the offense that installed for Drew Brees with a couple of packages here and there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really excited to see what that looks like. I mean, maybe it's not good, but maybe it's incredibly exciting and fun to watch, and can win football games. So I think people are too quick to write off Taysom Hill. I think he's different, but he's really, really interesting as a football player.
Yeah, absolutely. I talk a little bit about this quarterback battle all the time. I mean, obviously it's huge for the cycle and for the fans and everybody that wants to hear about it. And I often refer to Jameis Winston as kind of the front runner at the moment, based on the fact that he's got 5 years of starting NFL experience versus just a handful of games. But some of the things that I think Taysom Hill has the ability to show and learn here with a system that's built around him, there's no reason to fully count him out at this time, regardless of who you feel like is in the front at the moment. I know a lot of folks talk about the lack of ability to utilize, or not even lack of ability, but the lack of utilization of Alvin Kamara in the 4 games that he started in 2020. But I'm also very curious about how much of that adjustment happens when you build a system around him and you give him his rules, you give him his playthrough, you give him his progressions in a system that's built for him, as opposed to a system that he's just trying to squeeze into. And I imagine that utilization of all of the weapons becomes a part of the evaluation process when it comes to selecting your quarterback in the first place. And so I'm very, very intrigued and very interested to see what it is that we learn about Taysom Hill during this offseason with this competition here ready for him.
Yeah, I am too. And for what it's worth, I do mm-hmm. think, like, if you were asking me right now who I think the starting quarterback is, I think I'm going to say Jameis Winston 9 times out of 10. Yeah. Right. But, kind of going back to what we were just saying, if Taysom Hill is going to be the guy, let's just consider this scenario.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to be running the exact same thing they were last year when he was in there.
Right.
It's going to be more tailored toward his skill set. And then you've also got to consider that those 4 games he started last year, one of them you can just throw out. The Broncos game was just a travesty, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you can throw that one out. And I think really you're looking at the first 3 starts of a guy's career. And the amount of weight that people have placed on that as like surefire evidence that this guy can't do it is just it's astounding to me, because it's like you don't ever do the same thing for other guys making their first 3 starts of their career.
Sure.
Like I understand that he's been in the system for a while and he's supposed to be a little bit more polished. And I thought he was, like, for big stretches of those games, I thought there was some really encouraging things that he did.
Mm-hmm.
But there's still his first 3 starts.
Yeah, right.
Like you should give the guy a little bit more rope to work with here, and you should understand that, like, at some point, he's not just going to continue to ignore one of the NFL's best pass catching running backs. They're going to work that in there.
Yeah.
Okay. And, I just refuse to believe that's like his ceiling and that's the best he'll ever be. And I think that yes, there's also the argument to be made that like with more film against him, there's you can prepare for him better, you can give him more looks that'll confuse him. But I also think that with more time on the field playing quarterback, he will be a much better player.
Yeah.
So I just hate seeing that argument against Taysom Hill, and a lot of the armchair quarterbacking that goes with it. I think he's a better player than people give him credit for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think the Saints are too worried about, film getting out there and them, not being able to evolve their system around it, considering Sean Payton was on Twitter just last offseason sharing snapshots of his playbook, right? So,
yeah. Come on, keep doing more of that, Sean. I know, right? More.
For real, I completely agree. All right, y'all. One more big thank you to Luke Johnson at @ByLukeJohnson on Twitter. Make sure you throw him a follow for his incredible work. You'll hear more from him throughout this week, but want to remind you to go and check out the Locked On Today podcast next, because who would have thought that the biggest loser of the PGA Championship would have been Father Time himself? So go and check out Locked On Today, talking a bit about the Knicks and Phil Mickelson and his big win over the weekend. Meanwhile, here at Locked On Saints, we'll be back with you tomorrow for Twitter Tuesday and continuing on with our conversation with Luke Johnson, taking a look at the rookie class up next as we continue on throughout this week of Locked On Saints. And as always, I thank you very much for watching, for subscribing, for liking, for listening, sharing, everything that you do to help grow this family. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much. You can follow me on Twitter at RossJackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how your mom and them and trust you, that nation. I'll holla at you.